Thank you so much. It's so good to be here and to share more about the work that we are doing at Trusting News and also help journalists, all of you here, help fight misinformation, disinformation. One thing that we do at Trusting News related to and how we fit into the sphere of the misinformation and disinformation is helping journalists identify and talk about who they are to help build trust. And so I'm going to share more about what we know journalists can do to build that trust, because if journalists don't have that trust of their community, it's going to be a lot harder to fight misinformation and disinformation because you won't be looked at as that trusted source. And so I am going to share my screen here, and I also will put a link to this slideshow in the chat so that you can see it afterward. It also will have links to all of the examples that I share as well. And so at Trusting News, we work directly with journalists and researchers, and we are constantly testing our strategies to see if they work to build trust. So every example I'm showing you here today is something that a newsroom has tried, and we have seen by tying research to it, it is successful to build trust. And so when we talk about building trust, and you're thinking, okay, I am an ethical, responsible journalist. What should I do? The first thing is you need to accept that earning trust is the job of every journalist. Unfortunately, we no longer are operating in a time when just reporting the facts and doing good investigations is going to be good enough. We need to do more to convince our audience that we are trustworthy and they should believe the information that we are sharing. And this is something that the whole newsroom should take on. Reporters, editors, everyone needs to have a piece of this to really make it be successful. And so when we're thinking about building trust, a couple things that we tell our journalist is that, one, you may not be able to persuade everyone to trust you, and that's not a reasonable goal. But there are a lot more people in the middle who are willing to have conversations, learn about journalism, hear about your ethics, hear about your process, and give an opportunity to basically trust you and trust your content. We also want journalists to understand that being a news consumer is confusing. Some of the examples that Daniel was sharing, imagine if you are a news consumer on the other side trying to decipher and decide what is true and what is not. It's confusing, it's overwhelming. And many people have a very casual relationship with the news. Some of the Reuters data that Daniel was sharing, the most recent report, showed news avoidance is at an all-time high. People are tuning out of news. And so we ask journalists to keep that in mind, because by understanding what it's like to consume information, we can better serve our audience. We can better serve them with useful information and useful stories that then, if we're useful, if they see that we're helping them, that's something that can build trust. And so we also like to say when it comes to trust, there are broken relationships with our audience. There are things that the audience can do. Media literacy is absolutely something that can be helpful in this piece. There are also things tech companies can do. But what we focus on are things that journalists can do. These are things that are in our control, and no one else is going to explain how we operate and work to build those relationships if we don't. So we need to do this. And then probably the most important thing, if you take anything away today from what I'm sharing, the biggest reason what we have learned from news consumers that leads to distrust is a misunderstanding or not understanding of how journalism works. So trust actually works similarly to misinformation and disinformation. When you think about how misinformation and disinformation can get started, it often starts because there's an information gap. People don't know something. They then go try to search it out, and they may believe what they first find. Or you have bad actors filling that information gap with information that's incorrect or trying to focus and push an agenda. Well, we find that distrust in news works very similarly. People do not know how journalism operates. And if you think about it, why would they? We haven't done a good enough job explaining it. We've kind of taken it for granted that they would trust what we're sharing. Almost like if you're not a nurse, if you're not a plumber, you may not know how that works. So we need to fill that information gap, because if we don't, what happens is news consumers make an assumption. They make an assumption about why you're doing a story, why you're talking to that source. Most of the time, that assumption is negative, and they think it's because you have a bias or you're trying to fight for one side or the other. You have a favorite candidate. You're covering a sports team because your child goes to that school, all sorts of things. That's the assumption. The assumptions are negative. So the goal in what we talk about at Trusting News, fill that information void, and you're going to do that through transparency. So when we talk about our core 3 things that we tell journalists to do to build trust, the first is transparency. Talking about who you are, the fact that you have an ethics policy, you have a conflict of interest policy, there's a separation from your funding and how you operate and how you make news decisions. You want to be on the record and explain those things. And I have examples of how that works. The other really, really important aspect here is engagement. We cannot build trust with people that we don't know and don't interact with. If you think about people who you trust, they're most likely people you know or have at least had conversations with. Well, the same is true with trust in news and information. We need to do a better job of engaging with our audience, asking them, what do they think about our coverage? How could it be improved? Also, though, what problems are they seeing in their neighborhoods? What things do they want to know about? What questions do they have? And we're going to take that information and we're going to use it to help influence what stories we tell, who we talk to. Are we having enough diverse voices in our story to make sure we have the wide variety of viewpoints in our communities represented? And so that engagement is really key. The other thing is looking at the diversity in our newsroom. Who is making decisions? This goes beyond just race, ethnicity, and sex, though. This also is important to think about people who come from different socioeconomic backgrounds. What kind of education backgrounds do people have? We have to make sure that we are looking at who is in the newsroom making decisions and seeing what voids do we have, what is missing, and then how are we filling those voids? Are we having advisory boards with the public? Are we asking the public for feedback to kind of fill that void that we may not have? And so today I do have examples of the transparency and the engagement. I don't think I'll get to some of the diversity, but I will have links where you can learn more about all of this. And so when we talk about needing transparency and needing engagement in the diversity, this is needed on 2 levels. And we look at it as institutional and day-to-day. So the institutional things are your about page that maybe has staff bios. Maybe it has an ethics policy. Maybe it has a policy talking about who funds you, where you get your money, how you make reporting decisions. What is your mission? That is really good to have. If you have a page like that spells out and answers these questions for people, that can be something that can help build trust. Now, the problem is that a lot of news consumers aren't going to go searching for that page. Some will. And when people find it, that's going to be a green light for them that this is something that can be trusted. They're being transparent about it. But for those that aren't maybe the heavy news consumers, we need to get that message into day-to-day coverage when we have their attention. So this means adding some of that language and those messages into daily stories, sharing it on social. As Daniel just shared, a lot of people get their information from social media and online. So how are we getting these messages to them in those spaces? And so first, a couple examples about transparency. This is an example from the Radio Free Europe service in Hungary. We worked with them to redo their about page. So this would be an example of that institutional transparency. Before we worked with them, it had a lot of text. There were no images. It was hard to follow, and it didn't really answer questions about who was on their team, where they operated, how they were funded, and what their goals were. So we worked with them to add those elements. So you can see here now, very front and center, you can learn who the journalists are. And you can learn more by clicking on the links to the individual journalist. They created a video that talked about how their news service works, how they find stories, where they get their funding. They also talked about where you can see their work and what their values are about why a free Europe is important. So that is an example of that institutional. The question is, okay, how do you bring that to the day-to-day stories? What we have found to be the most successful is something that we call an explain your process box. Some of you maybe are using this, and more newsrooms are adding this, which is so great, because I'm going to share research in a second that we know that this helps build trust. So this is an example from the San Francisco Chronicle. And what they did is they, in their CMS, they embedded a box where they can answer questions about how they reported the story, why they use certain sources. So this is great to get that information from a page. Normally, people might write a separate story, how we did this investigation. That's probably something that you've written before, maybe. Well, now you're going to take that and put it directly into the story. And so, like I said, we did some research with this, and we know that when you add and explain your process box, it can increase trust. And in the examples, what we did is we answered 3 different questions: why a newsroom is doing a story, how they're doing it, and then in this case, it was a crime story. So what's your approach to covering crime? Do you use mugshots? How do you choose which crime stories to cover? And so what the research showed is that the stories that had those boxes in them increased the people's perception of the news organization on 11 of the 12 items related to trust. And so this is important too, because when you say, oh, do you trust something? Well, that could mean different things. It could mean that people feel that it's fair, it's reliable, it's accurate, it's unbiased. Does it tell the whole story? So there's lots of different meanings to trust. And so we really like this research because it points out that this box helped in almost all of those areas. The other good news, we did research for those of you who work with video or audio. This works on air with TV audiences. And again, I'm going to share a link to this, and we have more details on this research if you want to see the scripts and see the story examples. But what we found is that when you add this language, and primarily we added it to like the intro of the story or the tag of a story, or it was in a Q&A between like a reporter and an anchor, it helps build trust. People felt that the stories were more personal, provided more facts, had more context, and they generally were more complete. So another part of transparency is talking about who you are. Who are your journalists? We worked with the Radio Free Europe team in Kazakhstan, and we helped them redo all of their staff bios and then also create reporter mission statements. And so you may be thinking, okay, we have staff bios. What's the big deal? Well, not everyone actually does. And sometimes it's really hard to contact a journalist. One thing I will say about this is if you are reporting in an area where your safety is a concern, you definitely want to make sure that you aren't oversharing or putting yourself in a situation where there could be risk. But if there's some way you can have some kind of contact information, maybe it's for the news organization and things get forwarded to you. Maybe it's through some other kind of way to contact you that's encrypted, something like that. Contact information can be key to help build trust because it creates that engagement. But always make sure safety first, and that you are making sure to protect yourself and the safety of any reporters or editors that are working for you. But what's great about this is now, anytime someone, any of the journalists write a story, you can learn more about who they are. This adds credibility. Now, at the top, you have the staff bio. This talks about where they went to school, what their other journalistic experience is. But then you have a reporter mission statement. The goal here with this and how it's a little different is it's more written for the news consumer in mind. You're being specific about what you cover, what your goals are with your coverage. And if you are curious and want to create these, we have a kit that I will share that will help you do that. The great thing about these things about mission and sharing about who you are and talking about who you are, they work so well on social media and on video. And so we worked with the Siberian department within the Russian service of the Radio Free Europe. This was prior to the war in Ukraine. They created incredible videos that talked about why these journalists do what they do, and they have the added pressure of safety concerns. And so how we did this is the journalist, you did not hear their voice or see their faces. Instead, the journalist answered questions about why they do this work, why this is important. And then someone in Prague, which is where Radio Free Europe is based, they were the ones who did the voiceover for the videos, and then they used B-roll from different stories they've done in the past. These were really well received and are something they can use over and over again to talk about, this is our mission. This is why you can trust us. This is why we do this work. So the next part I want to talk about really quickly is just engagement. Engagement is really a key part of building trust and getting people to trust your work and come to you if they have a question about if something's real or not. This is an example from the Hungarian team with Radio Free Europe, and they wanted to know from their audience, what types of issues are really important to you? And so they did a survey. They solicited that survey through newsletters, on their website, and through social videos. They got a ton of responses. And basically, they looked at the responses and said, hey, what do people want to know about? How can we be useful to the community? And they found out people want to know about education. They want to know about health coverage, domestic politics, environmental protection. So then they took this information and they're using it to help influence their news coverage. Now, just because maybe someone says they want something, that doesn't necessarily mean you automatically do it. But you're going to use it to maybe influence and make your coverage better so you can better serve your audience. The Seattle Times in Washington State in the US also asked their audience, what questions do you have about our investigative journalism? They got 60 responses and they turned that into an FAQ. An FAQ is a great way to answer questions about your political coverage, how you cover crime, your mission and goals, because when you answer these questions, you can link back to them over and over again. And that's what they do. At the bottom of their investigative stories, they add this little box that says how our team does investigative journalism. And they link back to that FAQ. So that's going from institutional to that day-to-day coverage. They also share it on social media and they put it into newsletters. Another way you can engage, be present in your comments. I know this is hard if your organization is a big organization, and we have tips on that and things that can help with that, including a comment policy and a community guideline policy. But this is an example from the Coloradoan, a newspaper in Colorado. They were receiving a lot of questions about how they cover crime and why they were covering one crime versus another. And so they responded on Facebook to the comment, but then they also decided, let's write about this. Let's write about how we cover crime. And they said, we don't use mugshots. They also said, we are going to follow crimes from the beginning to the end. So they're getting on the record about what their goals are. Now that they created this, they can share it over and over again on social, within stories, or in individual emails when people reach out. So I know that was a lot of information, and we are glad to help with any of these elements or all of them if you want to really take this on. But the key is transparency, engagement, and diversity are going to be things that help you build trust. And if you are interested in diving deeper into any of this, we have kits that walk you through how to create a reporter mission statement, how to create a correction policy, and how to make it public, and all sorts of other topics. We also have a weekly newsletter that you can get a tip every week about how to build trust. And then probably one of the most exciting things, we have a full course that is free with Pointer that is how any journalist can earn trust. And it is, there's one for US journalists and there's one for international journalist with a section on fact checking. And if you ever want to get in touch with me, please do. We love to help journalists and want to help you with this very important issue. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And thank you so much.